My manipulative stepfather tried to steal my inheritance, yelled that he deserved it more. Some people say that family is everything, but what happens when the very people who are supposed to protect you turn out to be the ones trying to take everything from you? This is the story of how my manipulative stepfather tried to steal what was rightfully mine, how he fought tooth and nail to take my inheritance, and how, in the end, justice was served. I never had a great relationship with my stepfather, Dave. My mom met him when I was 12 years old, right after divorcing my biological father. At first, Dave seemed charming, always smiling, always playing the part of the perfect husband. "You're like a son to me," he'd say. But over time, I realized something. Dave was a fraud. He wasn't a loving father figure. He was a selfish, manipulative man who only cared about himself. He didn't marry my mother out of love. He married her because she was financially responsible, unlike him. I wasn't his family. I was competition. A few years ago, my mother passed away unexpectedly. Losing her was the hardest thing I had ever gone through. She was my entire world, my rock, my support system. I didn't have much family outside of her, so when she was gone, it felt like my entire connection to the world had disappeared. Before she passed, she had been very clear about her wishes. She sat me down one day, took my hand and said, "I've made sure you'll be taken care of." I didn't think much of it at the time. My mother wasn't wealthy, but she had worked hard her whole life. She had a small life insurance policy, a house, and a few investments, nothing extravagant, but enough to set me up for a stable future. She had always been careful with her money, and I had no doubt that she had put everything in my name, since I was her only child. It seemed like a simple thing. I was so wrong. At first, Dave played the role of the grieving husband. He cried at the funeral. He hugged me, pretending to be fatherly. He even said, "We have to look out for each other now." But within days, his tone changed. It started small. He'd make comments like, "You know, managing an estate is a lot of responsibility. Maybe we should sit down and talk about what's fair." At first, I thought he was just trying to help. But the more he talked, the more I realized what he was really saying. He believed he was entitled to my inheritance. Just 2 days after the funeral, Dave showed up at my apartment unannounced. I opened the door and saw him standing there, his face flushed, his hands twitching. He looked angry, desperate. "We need to talk," he said, pushing past me before I could even respond. He sat down, his fingers drumming against my table, and then he said it. "Look, kid, your mother and I were married for over 20 years. I took care of her. I handled the bills, the house, everything. I deserve a part of that money more than you." I stared at him, my jaw tightening. "Are you serious?" His eyes flashed with irritation. "You're young. You wouldn't even know what to do with all of this. It makes more sense for me to manage it." Manage it? He wasn't asking for a share. He was trying to take everything. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. "Dave, my mother made it very clear what she wanted. The will is already set." That's when he snapped. His voice rose, his face reddened, and he slammed his fist on the table. "You don't understand. I deserve this. I took care of her while you were off doing whatever. I was her husband. That means something." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This man, who had treated my mother like an afterthought for years, was now standing in front of me, trying to rewrite history just so he could take what wasn't his. I kept my voice steady. "You need to leave, Dave. Right now." His nostrils flared, his fists clenched. For a moment, I thought he was going to lunge at me, but instead, he let out a bitter laugh. "This isn't over." Then, he stormed out, and I knew this was only the beginning. For a few days, I didn't hear from him, but I knew it was far from over. And sure enough, a week later, I got a call from a lawyer. Dave was contesting the will. He was claiming that I had manipulated my mother while she was sick, pressuring her to leave everything to me. Me, the son who had been by her side every single day. The son who had taken care of her in her final months while Dave barely lifted a finger. The audacity was unbelievable. His lawyer claimed that because Dave had supported her in her final years, he deserved a portion of the estate. It was a blatant lie, but I knew this wouldn't be an easy fight. Because men like Dave, they don't stop until they're forced to, and I was about to make sure that he lost everything. I knew Dave wouldn't go down quietly. Men like him, manipulative, entitled, desperate for control, don't just accept defeat. They fight, lie, cheat, and steal their way through life, convinced that the world owes them something. And true to form, Dave didn't waste any time. 1 week after our confrontation, I got a call from a lawyer. Dave was contesting the will. I could barely believe what I was hearing. On what grounds? I asked, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. The lawyer sighed. He's claiming undue influence. He says you manipulated your mother into leaving everything to you while she was sick and vulnerable. I let out a bitter laugh. That's insane. Because it was. My mother had been clear-headed. She had made her decisions without pressure because she wanted to make sure I was taken care of. And now, Dave was trying to twist that into something sinister. Do we have to go to court? I asked. Most likely, my lawyer said. But don't worry. This case is weak. He has no proof. The will is airtight. But I knew Dave. I knew he wouldn't stop just because the truth wasn't on his side. And I was right. Months of legal battles followed. Emails, depositions, a seemingly endless back and forth between lawyers. Every step of the way, Dave kept escalating his lies. He told the court that I had isolated my mother in her final years, cutting her off from family and friends. He claimed that I had pressured her into rewriting the will, using her declining health to manipulate her. He even went as far as to paint himself as the grieving, loving husband, the one who had been there for her, the one who had taken care of everything. I sat in court, listening to him lie through his teeth, and I could barely contain my anger. But when it was my turn to speak, I destroyed him. My lawyer stood up. Can you describe your relationship with your mother before she passed? I took a deep breath. She was my best friend, I said. She raised me alone before she met Dave. We talked every day. She told me everything. And did she ever mention feeling pressured by you to change her will? Never. Then came the evidence. We had emails from my mother discussing her estate plans, long before she got sick. Medical records proving she had been of sound mind when she signed the will. Witnesses, her attorney, her doctor, even some of her old friends, who all confirmed she had made her choices on her own. It was bulletproof. And when my lawyer finished, Dave looked pale. Because he knew he had lost. The courtroom was silent as the judge looked directly at Dave and said, "Your claim has no merit. The will stands as written. The estate belongs to the rightful heir." Dave froze. For the first time, he had no comeback. His lawyer looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. I expected Dave to explode, to shout, rage, demand a retrial. But instead, he just sat there, his face turning an ugly shade of red, staring at the judge like he couldn't comprehend what had just happened. Then, the judge delivered the final blow. Furthermore, the court finds no evidence of undue influence. Your accusations against the rightful heir are dismissed. Case closed. And just like that, it was over. Or at least, I thought it was. Because men like Dave, they don't accept defeat. They plot revenge. And sure enough, within days, Dave made one last, desperate move. I should have felt relief when the judge ruled in my favor. I should have been able to breathe easy knowing that my mother's will, her final wishes, had been upheld. But men like Dave don't just take their losses and walk away. They double down. They escalate. They get desperate. And sure enough, within days of losing in court, Dave filed an appeal. I got the call from my lawyer late one evening. Dave isn't done, he said. He's trying to challenge the ruling. I nearly laughed. On what grounds? He's claiming that the will was created under suspicious circumstances and that we need to reevaluate the division of assets. I shook my head in disbelief. We already proved it was valid. I know, my lawyer said, but he's hoping that if he keeps dragging this out, you'll get tired and settle. Settle? Not a chance in hell. Dave had already taken so much from me. He had stolen years of my peace, filled my childhood home with manipulation and greed, and spent months trying to rob me of what my mother left behind. I wasn't going to give him a single cent. By the time we went back to court, Dave had recruited backup. His brother, Steve, had flown in for moral support. Steve was just like Dave, loud, aggressive, always ready for a fight. The second I walked into the courtroom, he sneered at me. "You ready to give up your little game?" he muttered as I passed. I ignored him. I had bigger things to focus on. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about principle. This was about making sure that Dave never got away with his lies. Dave was more desperate than ever, and it showed. His lawyer started spewing the same nonsense, that Dave had been my mother's primary caretaker, that I had manipulated her into changing the will, that I didn't deserve to control everything. But this time, Dave wasn't composed. He was visibly angry, his hands gripping the table, his jaw tight as his lawyer spoke. And then, he snapped. Right in the middle of the hearing, he stood up and yelled, "I loved your mother more than you did." The entire courtroom fell silent. My lawyer turned to me, his eyebrows raised. I just stared at Dave, feeling nothing but disgust. Because this wasn't love. This was greed. This was a man who couldn't stand losing. The judge, unimpressed, raised his hand and asked for silence. Then, he turned directly to Dave and asked a simple question. "Do you have any evidence to support your claims?" Dave opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He looked at his lawyer, panicked. His lawyer just shrugged, clearly as lost as Dave. The judge waited a moment, then shook his head. "I'll take your silence as confirmation that you have no case." Appeal dismissed. It was over. Again. But this time, it felt final. As I walked out of the courtroom, I turned back just in time to see Dave's expression crumble. The man who had spent months trying to cheat me out of my inheritance was now nothing more than a defeated, pathetic excuse of a man. Steve, his brother, was furious. He grabbed Dave by the shoulder and hissed, "You told me you had this in the bag." I couldn't help it. I smiled. Because for the first time in my life, Dave had no control over me. He had lost. And he knew it. I thought that was the end of it. But 2 days later, I received a letter from a private investigator. At first, I was confused. I hadn't hired anyone to look into Dave. But when I opened the envelope, my blood ran cold. The investigator had been hired by a real estate agency, one that Dave had been in contact with months before my mother passed away. Why? Because he had tried to sell off her properties, before the will was even read. Before my mother had even passed, Dave was already trying to get rid of her assets and pocket the money. The dates lined up perfectly. The phone records were there. There were even witnesses who confirmed that Dave had tried to offload the property under the table. And now, I had proof. I had thought the courtroom defeat would be the end of it. I thought Dave would finally accept that he had lost, that my mother's estate was legally mine, that he had no claim, and that his lies had crumbled in front of a judge. But Dave was never the kind of man to take responsibility. And when entitled people lose, they don't just walk away. They lash out. When I got the private investigator's report, my heart started racing. The documents showed that months before my mother passed, Dave had been in contact with a real estate agency. Why? Because he had already tried to sell one of her properties. Before the will was even read, before she had even passed, he was acting like her assets belonged to him. And the worst part? The investigator had found witnesses. 2 realtors who confirmed that Dave had been trying to offload the property behind my mother's back. This wasn't just greed anymore. This was fraud. I called my lawyer immediately. He listened in silence as I read off the dates, names, and evidence from the report. When I finished, he let out a low whistle. "This changes everything," he said. "We're not just talking about a contested will anymore. We're talking about attempted fraud. What do we do?" I asked. He didn't hesitate. "We file a civil suit against him." The next day, I had my lawyer send Dave a formal notice that we were filing a lawsuit against him. The moment he received it, he went insane. That night, at 1 a.m, I woke up to a loud banging on my front door. It was Dave, and he was drunk. I didn't answer, but I could hear him shouting through the door. "You don't get to take everything," he slurred. "This is my inheritance. I deserve it." I grabbed my phone and immediately called the cops. The second he heard me say, "Yes, officer. He's at my door right now," Dave let out a loud curse, stumbled off the porch, and disappeared into the night. That was the last straw. The next morning, I went straight to the courthouse and filed a restraining order. Dave wasn't just trying to steal from me anymore. He was dangerous. I told the judge everything. His attempt to sell off my mother's property before she even passed. His lies in court. His drunk outburst at my house in the middle of the night. By the end of the hearing, the judge agreed immediately. The restraining order was granted. Now, if Dave even tried to come near me again, he would be arrested on the spot. With the restraining order in place, the civil lawsuit moved forward. By now, Dave wasn't as confident as before. The smug arrogance was gone. In court, his lawyer tried to downplay everything. My client was simply grieving. He didn't mean to cause harm. But my lawyer wasn't having it. He laid out all the evidence, the fraudulent attempts to sell property, the financial records, the witness statements. Then he turned to the judge and said, "This is not the behavior of a grieving husband. This is the behavior of a manipulative con man who was trying to steal from his late wife's only child." The judge listened carefully. Then, he gave his ruling. Dave was found guilty of attempted fraud. Not only was his appeal dismissed, but he was ordered to pay restitution for any damages caused by his attempts to illegally sell the property. It was over. This time, for good. Dave's entire world fell apart after that. He lost everything. The inheritance he tried to steal. Any control over my mother's estate. His reputation, now permanently stained. A few weeks later, I heard through a former neighbor that he had packed up and moved out of town. Where did he go? I asked. She shrugged. No one knows. He just vanished. Good. Now, for the first time in years, I can finally breathe again. No more court battles. No more threats. No more manipulation. Just peace. I've moved into my mother's house, the one that Dave tried so hard to take from me. I've started renovating it, making it my own. And most importantly, I've learned that family isn't about blood. It's about who truly stands by you. Dave tried to destroy my life. But in the end, he destroyed himself. And I walked away stronger than ever.